Next up, we'll cover another very important property. It is the display property. So early on, like very, very early on, I think maybe the first 15 videos of the course, I showed this slide where I talked about how some elements are inherently, or rather I should say by default, inline or by default block. So an inline element is going to fit alongside other elements in the same line. So you can see here, this guy in yellow is not pushing everyone else onto a separate line, which is what a block level element does. Now that's not actually the sole difference between the two. Now that we've covered things like margin and padding and width and height, we can further explore the difference. So there is a property called display. And this display property actually does a lot. There are a lot of different possible values, which is why I wrote our first encounter. If you look at display on MDN, these are all the possible different options that we can set display to. So there's a lot of them here, although a lot of them currently are not fully implemented or have been phased out across different browsers. There's a lot of red here, but still there's a lot of green too. So we're going to focus just on 3 possible values to start: inline, block, and inline block. It's kind of confusing. Inline, and then block, and then inline dash block. So let's head over to an empty document I've made. I'm in a new folder. I'm just calling it display. There's nothing to look at yet. And I'm going to start by just putting 2 H1s here. I am H1, and then duplicate that. I am also H1. Okay? And as we know, I'm going to refresh. These elements by default, all heading elements, are going to be block level elements. They are not inline. So if I give H1's a background color, background color of, how about pale goldenrod? Sure. And let's give them a border, just a small one, 1 pixel solid black. And I refresh, we can see that the element itself extends, each one of them extends all the way across the available space. So in this case, that's the entire body. So these are block level elements. Headings are. Other elements like paragraphs are by default block level, but we can actually change this behavior. And then we have other elements like, spans. Let's add 2 spans in here. Span, I am span. Let's do another one. I am also span. And let's give each of our spans a background color. How about pale something else, pale turquoise, and a border of 1 pixel solid black as well. We refresh. No surprise, hopefully. Spans by default are inline. They do not take up an entire line of space. They don't push other elements or other content onto a separate line. There's no break, versus the block level elements like H1s. So the display property allows us to change that. For example, on my H1s, I can set display to inline. That word inline is very important here. Take a look at what happens. These previously block level elements are now behaving as inline elements, just like a span. They are bigger. That's just the text size. I could change that. I could set font size to be whatever this is, but ignoring that, they're behaving the same way. They are not breaking onto a new line. They're not taking up all the available space going across the screen. They are inline. And likewise, I can do the same thing. Actually, I guess likewise is not the right term. Unlikewise, I could set all spans to have a display of block. They're currently inline, but I could set them to be block. And there we go. Now, our previously inline spans are taking up an entire line or chunk of content horizontally. This one pushes whatever comes after it onto a new line. It forces a break. They're behaving as block level elements. So the reason I'm introducing this right now, I'm skipping inline block for just a moment. The reason I'm introducing it now is because of how inline and block level elements behave with margin and padding and width and height. So I'm going to make another example here. Just get rid of this. We don't really need it for now. I'm going to make a paragraph with a bunch of lorem ipsum text in here. So let's do something like lorem times 10. That might be a bit much. And then I'm just going to pick somewhere inside of this to put a span. And this span will just say something stupid. I am span. Okay, so I still have my styles being applied. So this span is a block level element. I'm going to delete all of that. Now it's hard to see, but there's our span. So I'm going to make it obvious. I'm going to give all spans for now. There's only one. Background color again. How about pale violet red? And then a border, 1 pixel solid black. And let's see what that does for us. Okay, so there's our span. Now what I want to focus on is what happens if I change margin, or what happens if I change padding, or why don't we start with width? What if I want this thing to be wider? It's a span. I'm going to make it have a width of maybe 500 pixels. That's definitely wider than what we see right now. I refresh, nothing happens. Why? Well, that's just what happens with inline elements. If an element has display of inline, width is ignored, height is ignored. What about things like padding? What if I do padding of 10 pixels on all 4 sides? Okay, so that worked, right? We can see that that padding is respected and it's added in. What if I do like 100 pixels? Very large amount of padding. It's a little hard to see because of this background color, but this span right now, this big old block with all that padding, it's not actually pushing content away. It is not taking up space. It's kind of just like sitting on top or sitting below, depending on how you want to look at it, the rest of the content. So yes, we do have padding, but if I get rid of that background color, you'll see that it's not really like a force field or anything. I don't know if that helps to explain it, but the content just ignores it, right? So the padding is there on the element itself, but it's not respected by the rest of the content on our page. So what about margin? I'm going to go back. Let's do something like maybe 50 pixels for padding, and then do margin 50 pixels on all sides. Are we going to have 50 pixels of space everywhere? No, we don't. What happens instead is that, yes, that margin is respected horizontally, at least on this one line that is in line with our element, right? IM span, it's in line here. So 50 pixels, but vertically, it's completely ignored. And that's important. That's a really important point to understand. And if we compare that with block, so if I just have, let's just do an H1 or maybe 2 H1s up top, H1, I am H1 again, duplicate that, I am also H1, all right, and then we give them, same thing we've done here, I'm just going to copy this to start, H1's background color will be pale, turquoise or something, black, okay. So with block level elements, there we go, we've got 2 of them here. If I set them to have a width, we've already seen this before, a width will be respected. If I do width of 300 pixels, they are now 300 pixels. That was not the case with my span here. If I give them a height of about 200 pixels, that is also respected. So width and height work. They're not ignored like they are on an inline element. And if I do something like give them padding, how about just an extra 50 pixels of padding everywhere? That applies. So we do have that padding everywhere. And lastly, margin. If I apply margin, top, bottom, left, right, it doesn't matter where, it is going to take effect. It's going to be a real margin. So 100 pixels margin on all 4 sides, that is respected. Unlike this margin here, which only worked on this one line of text, everything else is kind of just like overlapping. They're living in the same space. It's not an actual force field pushing anything away. So that's important to understand the difference between inline and block with respect to these new properties we've learned, margin and padding, and width and height. Now that brings us to the third value that we're going to cover, which is inline block. So this is going to behave like an inline element, except width, height, margin, and padding are going to be respected. So I'll show you an example of this. Let's just have, I guess, should I do it up top? Sure. We'll have a couple of divs, just generic divs. Let's do 3 of them. And I'm going to give all divs a height. I'll make them squares maybe. 200 pixels, a width, 200 pixels. I'll give them a background color. Background color this time will be olive drab. Let's see what they look like. Okay, let's give them a border. 1 pixel solid black. Now before I refresh, why do they look like this? Why is it a rectangle? I thought I had 3 divs here, 200 by 200. Well, we do, but they are block level elements, so they take up a full block. Even if I made the width narrower than the rest of this page, the element itself is going to take up all that space, if you can see right there. So the background and the color itself, the green, is small, but it's not going to share space because it is not an inline element. So I'm going to refresh. Here's our border. Maybe something slightly thicker, about 5 pixels. All right. And now if I want them to be in a row, I want 3 of them in a row together, And I want them to be a little bit spaced out too. I want some margin between them. Well, if I tried to set them to be inline, display of inline, oh, we run into some serious issues. Why is that? Because width and height aren't respected, as we saw, for an inline element. But if I do inline dash block, and I refresh, there we go. So now they are behaving like inline elements. They are sharing the space or sharing the row, right? They're sitting in line together. They're not forcing each other onto a separate line. But all of the other properties with respect to the box model are going to work. So width and height, they work. Margin will work. If I set margin to be, I don't know, how about 50 pixels on all sides? That works. There are 50 pixels on the top, left, right, bottom, and all of that. Okay. So I think that's good enough for now. Some key differences there between inline block and inline block. Confusing to talk about. We'll learn more about the display property as we need it. I guess one thing I could show very quickly is that we can hide an element very easily, setting display to none. So if I instead did display none, how about on our H1s? Display none. The element itself is not going to be completely deleted or anything like that. It's actually there in the document. Here are the H1s, but they take up no space. We don't see them. Their display is set to none. So later when we get to JavaScript, that can be useful. You may want elements to be on the page that are not showing at the beginning, and then later you could show them, or vice versa. But for the most part, what we've covered here are inline block and inline block. 3 different options for display. It all has to do with how elements fit in with other elements and how they're affected by box model properties. Okay.